Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you are right now. My name is David Altschuler, and I'm the board chair for Canadian Friends of Tel Aviv University in the province of Ontario and all of Western Canada. On behalf of my board and our staff in Toronto and Montreal, I want to welcome you to the 2020 CFTAU Middle East Symposium, our first of the Jewish New Year. And this is a year, of course, like no other. With the academic year set to start in the coming weeks, we have launched a national scholarship campaign to help our students jobs and after this webinar, we will be reaching. Thank you for your participation and inviting you to consider helping these students at the Moshe Dayan Center, the INSS, and across our campus. Thank you in advance for your support. Our future really depends on them, and their future depends on us. During COVID, CFTAU has been working with Tel Aviv University and our Friends Association around the world to provide insightful programming, and today's symposium is no exception. Only a few weeks removed from the historic signing of the Abraham Accords and a mere 33 days away from the US election, ProfessorUzi Rabi is the director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies and is a senior researcher at the Center for Iranian Studies, both at Tel Aviv University. Formerly, he was the head of the Department of Middle Eastern and African History at Tel Aviv University, and from 2004 to 2005, he held a visiting professorship at the Lipinski Institute of San Diego State University. His research focuses on the modern history and evolution of states and societies in the Middle East, Iranian-Arab relations, oil and politics in the Middle East, and Sunni-Shia dynamics. Within this framework, he has supervised the dissertations of numerous doctoral candidates in this field over the years. Professor Rabi is regularly invited to the Knesset and other governmental forums to deliver briefings and lectures on matters of national and regional importance. Additionally, he has presented many academic papers over the years. He has given annual lectures at the Middle Eastern Studies Association Conference. In 2015, the subject of his lecture was Israel and Iran following the P5+1 nuclear treaty, or if you're from Europe, the E3+3 treaty. He has frequently given other lectures in both academic and non-academic forums. The latter includes a roundtable discussion at NATO's headquarters in 2008. Professor Rabi frequently provides expert commentary and analysis on a number of international and Israeli news outlets, including Arabic language television channels. During Operation Protective Edge, Professor Rabi was a fixture in both Israeli and international media. And with that, I turn things over to Professor Rabi.
Thank you so much for this generous introduction. Good morning, everybody. I mean, this is a real great pleasure to be with you today and to share with you some of our insights about our ever-changing region. Of course, 2020 is kind of a very tricky year. On the one hand, we had the coronavirus and still have it. And I hope that the next year will be different in that regard. But I think that beneath that, what happened in the Middle East in 2020 might be the beginning of kind of a geopolitical earthquake where every taboo has been broken, and what we got now is kind of a crossroads after which we're gonna have, I hope, kind of a different reality to deal with. Let's move to the map of the Middle East, which is the first slide, and just make sure that everybody knows that when we talk about the Middle East, of course, there are now what I would say three main blocks. And I'm going actually to make a long story short, because what happened 10 years ago in the Middle East was a set of upheavals that was depicted as the Arab Spring. In the aftermath, what we got, and for the whole decade until 2020, ruined states in several parts of the Middle East, failed states, and kind of a different power configuration. So to make a long story short, let me make sure that what we have here is kind of an understanding of how to view the geopolitical panorama of the Middle East. There is two main players, non-Arab, by the way, who once used to be moderate states, friends to Israel. But toward the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, both of them, each one of them with a long history, culture, huge appetite for hegemony, became very dominant players in this region. And each one of them is leading a certain camp which raises the banner of a different flag. Let's start with Iran, guys. This is Iran, you know, from 1979 to 2020. I mean, this state actually came up with what they call in Farsi, Jamhuriya Islami, which means Islamic Republic, no more monarchy. This is a Shiite state with an agenda by which to become hegemon in the Middle East. 41 years have passed. They managed to do that. There are a lot of problems in Iran. But when it comes to the regime, Ayatollahs and revolutionary guards, this lethal combination is coming up with something which is totally different. And if we're going to move to the other slide, please, we're going to see actually what Iran had made in the Middle East during this period. And look at that. Here is the trio. This is a guy that orchestrated all this thing that you see here. This is kind of a crescent, which was to become a nightmare for many states. Iran was to get control in parts of Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon in advance. Simply put, kind of a crescent that is being stretched up from the Persian Gulf to the eastern flank of the Mediterranean, tearing up Arab states who are becoming failed states, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and installing in these states kind of a Shi'i militia and swallowing up many, many slices, economically speaking, and creating a state within a state. This is how can we put it, just if meant by Iraqi Shiites and Shiites coming from Afghanistan and Iraq, you can see actually how cunning this strategy is. It's just capitalize on the way that we're falling into the cracks aftermath of the. This was the orchestrator, Qasem Soleimani, actually 2020. The guy in the middle is Hassan Nasrallah. This is a client which is makes a kind of a failed state and responsible for the suffering of Lebanon till now, especially when the explosion in June in the port of Beirut. And this is Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, that for one. She Persian, Iranian camp that has an agenda and basically has proxies all over the place. And of course, it is identified by Israel, anti-Western, anti-American presence in the region. And basically, this is one camp to be reckoned with when we are trying actually to map them out and have the power configuration in the Middle East. Let's move to the next slide. Let's talk about Turkey. It's headed by Recep Erdogan from the beginning of the 20th century. Here, he is a Sunni, but with some different flavors of Arab Sunni states. Why? Erdogan supports the current political Islam in the Middle East, which means Muslim brothers in Egypt, if you remember Morsi, Hamas in Gaza, Muslim brothers parties all over, and of course he is also supported by Qatar, but he is kind of a camp that is become very, very discernible when it comes to the power configuration in the Middle East, to be put actually on the other side of Iran, because basically they are rivals, but he's aiming at in this region. So there is concealed rivalry between Iran and Turkey, but at times we do see kind of an ad hoc alliance here and there, of course, but this is something else. Turkey, Qatar, and Muslim brothers all over the place, thinking of getting rid of other regimes. For example, Sisi in Egypt, monarchs all over the place, Jordan, Morocco, but especially Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and so on. And this brings us to the third camp. What we are left with, many Arab states that, while viewing what's going on in the recent decade, came up with kind of a thinking, different mode of thinking, unheard of when it comes to the Arab form. They ask themselves two main questions. First, man huwa al-adu, which means who my enemy is. This is a question that was a rhetoric one in the 20th century. Nobody should have asked, because the answer was loud and clear: Israel. Well, these states, name them: Jordan, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Sultanate of Oman, partially, Kuwait, some would say even Sudan, but this is kind of a different level. But all these states seem to realize that their enemy is definitely not Israel. It's the non-Arab actors, Iran and Turkey. And in order to foster a better future for their next generations, they must get rid of the taboos. For example, solidarity, different resolutions. Palestine, who were the one and only issue in the 20th century. If you would like actually to prove your Arabness, it's actually realized that this is so counterproductive to lip service time and again. This would be counterproductive when it comes to your national strength. And this is why we got, in some of the states, kind of a young leadership, MBS, Saudi Arabia, but more to the point, MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates, who started dealing with the whole platform in a different way. Israel was not the enemy. We have discerned that actually 5-6 years ago, when Israel was to be portrayed in the curricula for elementary schools, not as the Zionist entity, Al-Kiyan al-Sahayuni, but Israel, which is almost a small revolution, but this is one step to the right direction. Then they became talking in a different year about toleration, year of toleration, things that were to say something like, it is not only that Israel is not the enemy. Israel is the enemy of my enemy. So that you have kind of a common denominator here. And let me build up on top of it, as I heard too many a time from Emiratis and other Gulfians. We are small like Israel. We have kind of a financial situation which, relatively speaking, is good. We do think that the 21st century has to do with what we call high technology and all these gadgets of the 21st century. Basically, it's the same like Israel. So it's not only that Israel is not the enemy or the enemy of my enemy. It is that Israel should be cooperated with and to be talked to, because they're kind of a high potential of mutuality between Israel, United Arab Emirates, Israel, Bahrain, and I hope that Sultanate of Oman will be next in line. Saudi Arabia is a pretty complex issue, but they too allowed Israel to fly above or in their airspace, which in my opinion, having known actually Saudi history, this is again one small revolution. So let's move to the next slide, just to make sure what we are talking about now. What we have here is kind of a Middle East, which is torn up by Sunni-Shia conflict, Turks versus Kurds, all these camps that we just talked about. Look at that. This is the Nile. And the origins of the Nile are coming from Ethiopia. Egypt is anxious about Ethiopian efforts to drive much of the water toward its industry at the expense of Sudan, at the expense of Egypt. This is kind of another conflict by which to just give you an idea that the whole panorama has been changed, and many, many Arab states actually came to conclude that if they are going to stick to the notion that Israel is the erstwhile enemy, they are not going to have a future which would bring some hope for next generations in the 21st century. This is actually, ladies and gentlemen, this is, in my opinion, the whole thing. Of course, there are many things to be dealt with regarding that. But if we're going to just move on with the slides, you should see actually what the Emiratis, for example, were to get here or to come up with this normalization accord with Israel. Of course, United States is in the picture. Chinese versus Americans. And since China is becoming very dominant economically speaking in the Middle East, what the Americans actually try to do is to urge these Gulf states, where there's a lot of money and arms deal, to become part and parcel of this package deal. And this is kind of a Saudi American, I won't say concoction, but this is a grand design by which to have many Arab Sunni states, firstly in the Gulf, who are going to come under the orbit of the United States, now that the United States is much more choosy or choosier when it comes to the Middle East. It is not the US and the West we used to have in the 20th century or the 19th century when it comes to Britain and France. Much more hesitant, much less or less penetrative. You know that. But when it comes to that part of the Middle East, Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, plus Israel, Jordan, Egypt, this is something that the United States would like to bolster because it has kind of a vast interest in that, just to block the Chinese, maybe the Russians, but also to have some benefits when it comes to the economy, etc. The other thing is just to make sure that what we got here is also the accord that was signed, the previous month. It was depicted, the Abraham Accord. We can see that in the next slide, but the Abraham Accord, think of that. This is kind of a different concept, which was orchestrated by this guy, Mohammed bin Zayed, the heir in the United Arab Emirates, supported by the religious establishment. And let me give you the bottom line, because we don't have too much time to delve into too many details in that. If Abraham was my father and your ancestor, one way or the other, we should be cousins. This is it. And of course, the cultural, religious dimension was to be brought to the fore as kind of a thing by which to bolster the platform or the common denominator. I can tell you that because I was part and parcel of this thinking, and the cultural, religious dimension has been always taken as an obstacle, as a hurdle. What they managed to do, together with kind of a thinking that was in the region, let's give an alternative to the radicals, either Turkey, Iran, Sunni, Salafi. I didn't mention even the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, but they are coming up also with the other Islam. Toleration, respecting the otherness of the other. Yes, there's a lot of politics in it, sure. But it has to do with the curricula. It has to do with the way they treat Israelis. And I can tell you that even in the Israeli street, there is kind of an understanding that this peace treaty is definitely not what we got with Egypt and Jordan, important as they are, these treaties. But everybody would know that when it comes to the academic circles in both states, Egypt and Jordan, when it comes to state officials and at times in the street, well, Israel is not at all. The opposite is going to be here. So there is huge potential. And here comes the paradigm. For decades, in the Middle East and beyond, in the academia, US, Israel, whatever you would like, there was an axiom according to which actually Middle Eastern studies were taught for years. An analyst actually came up with their production time and again. This was the axiom. You won't have full normalization between Israel and Arab states unless you're going to have in advance comprehensive peace between Israelis and Palestinians. That was an axiom, which means that if you would like even to start thinking on the Middle East, this is your point of departure. You know what happened here with those normalization agreements? They tend to argue that the opposite was the truth. That many were mistaken to come up with this paradigm and to enforce actually the back of mind of many people to do things that way. If you are going to carefully listen to the voices coming from Iran, from the Palestinians, both Fatah and Hamas, from Turkey, this vicious orchestra against UAE, against Saudi Arabia, against Israel, against the United States, you would understand that they feel as if somebody is pulling the rug under their feet. Why? because they made a living from this axiom for years. And now they know that something has happened here. For me, this is the beginning of a geopolitical revolution. And here is the added dimension. And I hope that I'm not too much optimistic. Having known for years, actually, the Gulfians, having understood and being aware of their being kind of a pure businessman or business-oriented, I think that all of us could tell that this is kind of a different move, kind of a fresh start, a blessed step. What we have to do is just to wait and see how things are going to be played here. There is also the Palestinian problem still hanged on that. Paradoxically speaking, these normalization agreements with Gulf states, and I hope with others too, are going to make both Palestinian and Israelis coming up with something which would be reasonable. It is not to say that UAE has nothing to do with the Palestinians, not at all. But they say loud and clear, Palestinians are going to come up with something which is realistic. What does that mean, realistic? Not the Oslo Accords, null and void. If you snooze, you lose. This is what the Palestinians asked. But they have the Trump deal, or the centuries deal as they depict it. They're going to get, in the framework of which, of this, they're going to get a state for their own. They can have a hope for their later or next generations. And both Israelis and Palestinians could prosper together if that spirit of toleration, of respecting the otherness of the other, is going to be here. History is cruel. Geopolitics is cruel. I'm not saying that Israel is just the righteous part. But you know, this is politics of survival. There are losers, there are winners. But I think that if we are going actually to adopt the spirit that we just see here, we are going actually to be in kind of a situation of win-win, everybody. So if we're going to move to the last slide, and that would be my concluding note. Another one, please. This is the, so we ask ourselves who's next, and we know actually that there are states like Saudi Arabia, like Sudan, like the Sultanate of Oman here, but we shall wait and see. Take into account that we had two, is this the last slide? We have another one, so let's move that. If that, oh, here it is. Those two scenes were seen in the Middle East recently. The first of which is the explosion in the port of Beirut. Beirut, a lovely city. 50, 60 years ago, Switzerland of the Middle East. It is ruined. Look at the ammonia and all this suffering that many civilian neighborhoods around the port are suffering from these days. Every authentic Lebanese will tell you that the Trojan horse named Hezbollah, installed by Iran, made Lebanon actually being falling into the cracks. If you're going to stick to this camp, this is what you're going to get in the end of the day. There is another way. This is the plane. I was to actually embark from Tel Aviv, crossing the Saudi desert, landing in Abu Dhabi, just 3 hours. But this was something that bears within it kind of a great hope for a different way for the Middle East. It's a pity that in Corona days today, when everybody is suffering from that, and there is kind of a it's very understandable, very human. Everybody has its own problems, economic, health problems, problems, social problems. We know that. But this is the great hope. If and when, with God's help, in post-corona days, I do hope that we will manage to see in kind of a clearer way the bright light in the Middle East, which says that at least when it comes to some parts of the Middle East, there is kind of a high time or great opportunity to come up with something which is different than the stuff we used to have in the 20th century. Thank you. Chag Sameach. And I would really like to take your comments and questions. Please.
So, Professor Rabi, we have a couple of questions here. The first question is from Gladys. She'd like to know how the Lebanon crisis into this new version of, or the new scenario of the Abraham Accords. How do they intersect with each other, or do they?
First of all, Gladys, it's great to hear from you. Missing you. I don't forget actually the help and the support actually we got from you. And I hope that you and the family actually are okay. So send regards to my friends there. And Gladys, Lebanon is a failed state. I don't know actually what we can do or somebody can do in order to save it. You know, Lebanon, Yemen, Libya, Iraq are states that were ruined because parts of them are being taken captive by outsiders, mainly Iran, but also Turkey. So now, what we have in Lebanon is, you know, kind of some players who are trying to renew the old trick by which Israel should be blamed for everything, which was actually the, let's say, the motto of the 20th century. It doesn't work anymore, but Lebanese are suffering. No government, because Hezbollah won't let any government actually be compiled there. Who told you that? Macron, 2 days ago. He visited actually Lebanon after the explosion. Lebanese, you know what they asked him? Please take us. Come back to the Middle East. Renew the old mandate of France in Lebanon. Of course, time is running very short for the Lebanese. I know that there are authentic Lebanese that are going actually to be maybe supported by anti-Iranian states or anti-Iranian movements. But I hope that, you know, Lebanon will be cured at least partially, but I think that this failed states, and this is something that has to be dealt internationally. If the United States, Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, and others are going to sit at the table, this is the only way by which actually to solve all the problems of Lebanon. Other than that, actually, everybody is going to take his own slice, and to make the chaos or the chaotic situation be kept intact, because it has to do with this. I mean, there's, I would say, outsiders actually taking care of their own interest. Sad, full of agony, this Lebanon. But you know, Gladys, Lebanon was Switzerland of the Middle East, as I said, in the 60s. Iraq was once kind of a great state in the 20s or 100 years ago. If these states are going to be taken by tyrants, if these states are going to be taken captive by outsiders, this is what they're going to get. And I do hope that the young generation, maybe in both states, and there are many, many courageous Lebanese, we do talk to them day by day, 24/7. Twitter, Instagram, Telegram, whatever. They do protest, but they don't have the power actually to come up with a change. Let's hope for the good actually in the later decades when those young people are going actually to take maybe control of their affairs and their destiny. This is my hope. But I think that with the incumbents, this is something that something good won't happen here. Not in Iran, not in Lebanon, not in Iraq. So let's wait and see. But these states are very, very difficult to be cured because they are just failed states. You know, in Arabic even, there is kind of this idiom of dawla fashila, failed states, which is, it's broken now. And let's see if there would be kind of an international hand to be given here, or some internal changes with the next generation. You know, it will take time, but this is it for the time being. Thanks.
So perhaps we have time. I'm going to combine two questions because I think they're related. Michelle wanted to know to what extent if I'm paraphrasing, the push towards the Abraham Accords was the brainchild or being pushed by Trump and his administration. And if it wasn't Trump and his administration, then who was it? And the second part of the question, I don't know who it's from, but the second part of the question from someone else is, does any of this change, or does any of the momentum decrease or increase if Joe Biden becomes president?
Well, that's a very good questions, and thank you for combining them because this is right to the point. So Michelle, definitely, the Trump administration is behind that thing for years, Now, it is not that he pushed them in. They would really like actually to bolster their relations with the Trump administration because, first of all, you know, back in their mind, they would like to see 4 more years of Trump. Why? Because they do afraid of the Democrats coming back and renew the agreement with Iran, which is a nightmare for them. This is not my interpretation. They say it loud and clear, so you can take it to the bank, what I'm saying here. They are supportive of Trump because in their eyes, Trump is the most, and I think, kind of a guarantee against the Iranian ambitions. And since Iran is their erstwhile enemy, they would like actually to measure things in that way. So it's not only kind of an American push, it is also something that comes from within. So this is why I said that this is a Saudi American concoction, which is trying to capitalize on this in order to create kind of a power configuration in the Middle East that would preserve some of the power in the hands of the United States and its allies in the region against the challenge which is being posed by other camps, definitely. So this is geopolitics, definitely. And Trump maybe, you know, politically or electorally speaking, do or does think that this is something that is going to be, or to bring in more voters for him in the coming election, which I'm not sure about that. But this is in the Middle East. Paradoxically put, Iran is waiting for Biden. Gulf states would like actually to have 4 more years of Trump because this is the safer side when it comes to them because they look at Iran. So in the Middle East, things are being measured in a different way. You know, I mean, thank you for combining these two questions because it is interrelated. And because of what I just said, there was kind of, you know, some speedy moves by the American administration to wrap it up and come up with this ceremony in the White House before November in order to just make sure that this would be interpreted as peace over the Middle East, which is not. It is in the Middle East, parts of the Middle East, a blessed movement, kind of a courageous move by those tiny states who are very, very rich and are coming, you know, loud and clear saying that, guys, don't sell me this nonsense of the 20th century. If you are going to start with Israel, this is not my plate. We have problems. We need to bolster or to foster our future strategy. Israel is part and parcel of our future plan. This is the news. And I think that this is kind of a fresh start. It has a huge potential, as I said before, and I do hope that with the passage of time, many states are going to, capitalize on that or be on board in order to further isolate the radicals. And Palestinians are going to have a new leadership with kind of a new mode of thinking and would come with something which is reasonable. And I do hope that they would get their own state. It's something that they didn't dreamt of because they thought they should get more and more. But I say that this is something that, of history, of geopolitics, they didn't take the right decision in the right time, and they're going to actually lose part of it. But if Palestinians are going to come to the fore, if we are going actually to do things together with the help of those rich states in the Gulf, we're going to have some parts of the Middle East being changed at least slightly, and with the next generations, with what we're going to have and see here when it comes to the virtual space, we have kind of a contact with people of all over the Middle East, Arabs and others. And this is something by which to say that Israel has become a recognizable state, part and parcel of the Middle East. This is good for Israelis. We should start teaching Israelis about the Middle East, Arabic, Persian, Turkish, because Israelis actually are identifying themselves as part and parcel of the Western world. Yes, we are, but we are in the Middle East, so we have to come up with something which is the middle of the road in that sense. So we have a lot of problems actually, or a lot of stuff to deal with, but this is a good start. And this is why I think 2020 is kind of a year to be remembered. I do hope that history would go back to 2020 as kind of a year that on the one hand actually brought in the COVID-19 pandemics, which is a disaster. But on the other hand, at least when it comes to the Middle East, there were some developments that were to be further elaborated on and create kind of a Middle East that is different from what we got in 2020.
Thank you, Professor Rabi. We're going to be to our next speaker, but I did want to thank you very much for your presentation. It was very informative in the answers to the questions. I have, probably another half dozen questions that were coming in fast and furious. Some of them were very interesting. The bad news is, unfortunately, we don't have time today. The good news is you're not going anywhere, and we're going to have other opportunities to interact with you. And of course, we welcome the opportunity, or we hope that we'll have the opportunity soon to welcome you back here to Canada, where you can speak and deal with some of these questions in person. We hope to have an opportunity where we can come join you in Israel. And of course, everyone watching should know that at Canadian Friends, we can certainly facilitate any contact, any meetings that you would like to arrange with any of our faculty, including our experts at the Moshe Dayan Center and the INSS. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Peter, who will introduce our next speaker.
Okay, thanks very much, David. So my name is Peter Slan, and like David, I'm also a board member of Canadian Friends of Tel Aviv University. And it's my pleasure to be here today to introduce our next speaker, Daniel Shapiro. Dan and his wife, Julie, have been friends of mine since we went to summer camp together for several summers, long time ago. I think it's about 35 years ago now. Unfortunately, the pandemic required me to cancel a trip to Israel that I had planned earlier this year. So I haven't seen Dan in person since my last trip to Israel, which was almost 4 years ago now, when Dan and Julie were kind enough to invite me and my family to their youngest daughter's bat mitzvah. But Dan, it's great to see you here today. Thank you for joining us, even if it is only virtually. Daniel Shapiro is a distinguished visiting fellow at Tel Aviv University's Institute for National Security Studies, where he participates in several of the Institute's research programs, including those on Israeli-US relations, Israeli-Palestinian relations, the Arab world, and Israeli society and public opinion. Ambassador Shapiro is a frequent contributor to leading publications, including Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and The Wall Street Journal. And he provides his analysis and commentary in many Israeli and American media outlets. Before joining the INSS, Dan served as United States Ambassador to Israel under President Obama from 2011 to 2017. In that role, he participated in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, US-Israeli discussions on the Iran nuclear agreement, and negotiations on the $38 billion Memorandum of Understanding for US military assistance to Israel. Prior to his term as ambassador, Dan served on President Obama's National Security Council as Senior Director for the Middle East and North Africa, where he was a member of the Special Envoy George Mitchell's team. He led US diplomatic efforts in Syria and Lebanon and advised President Obama through the early months of the upheavals in Arab states in 2011. He also served in numerous senior advisory positions in the US Congress, including with Senator Bill Nelson of Florida, Senator Dayan Feinstein of California, and on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Ambassador Shapiro has taught at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He holds a bachelor's degree from Brandeis University and a master's degree from Harvard University. Dan, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. We will have time for a few questions following Ambassador Shapiro's remarks, so please feel free to send in your questions via the Zoom chat function. And with that, Dan, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for this wonderful introduction, and thanks for not including any stories of hijinks from our summer camp days. But it's great to see you, and best wishes to your family. Thank you to everybody with Canadian Friends of Tel Aviv University for inviting me and for joining this discussion. It's been an absolute pleasure for the last 3.5 years since I completed my service as U.S. Ambassador to make my professional home at Tel Aviv University at the Institute for National Security Studies. There's no more stimulating place to think about and write about and research about the critical policy issues that I worked on in government now that I'm out of government, with extremely knowledgeable colleagues with deep connections in the Israeli system and really all over the world. And while it's a different sort of wing of the campus from where the Moshe Dayan Center sits, I benefit greatly from learning from Professor Rabi and his colleagues now, as I did when I was in government as well. So it's great to share the discussion with him. I just joined the Zoom now, so I apologize if I hope I won't cover too much of the same ground that Professor Rabi did. I don't think I will, but of course it starts with the normalization agreement with the UAE. That is, as I did catch the end of Professor Rabi's remarks, really the pivotal event that we have been privileged to witness and live through in these days of otherwise very difficult times of 2020. Probably a hinge event, a pivot that represents the beginning of the end, one hopes, or certainly the beginning of a very new phase of Arab-Israeli relations. Maybe I was going to say end of the Arab-Israeli conflict. I'm not quite sure we're there yet, but certainly a very new phase of Arab-Israeli relations going forward. And if you spend time talking to Israelis about this event, you are struck, I am struck by, frankly, the emotion that attaches to it. Israelis are excited. Certainly every Israeli I know is planning to take their family on a post-COVID vacation to Dubai. But more than excited about the prospects of personal involvement in this new relationship, they're moved. They're moved by the sense of acceptance that it represents. They're moved by answering a yearning that Israelis have felt since Israel's founding, to be accepted as a legitimate member of the neighborhood, to be in good relations with their neighbors, to not have to feel like they're living in an island that is surrounded by only hostile neighbors. Now, obviously, this is not the first peace agreement. Egypt and Jordan came long before, but those peace agreements, as we know, were somewhat characterized even to this day as a cold peace between leaders, between security establishments, but very little cultural exchange, very little popular connection with the people in those countries, and not much effort by the governments to encourage it, unfortunately. This peace agreement with the UAE, the one that accompanies it with Bahrain, and hopefully some that will follow, hold out the prospect of being something very, very different, taking a relationship that already existed on the basis of common security interests, the threats of Iran, the threat of jihadist movements like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, that has already facilitated quiet, under the table, if you will, secret contacts and security coordination between Israel and the UAE and other Gulf states. But now that it is coming out into the open, really flourishing as a relationship that will enable cooperation in every field, obviously in trade and tourism, but also in high technology and healthcare, in space, where the UAE and Israel both have advanced space programs, and almost any other energy, agriculture, water, almost any other field you could name, there is interest, and it is being actively supported and promoted by both governments. I've already been witness to a range of Zooms like this one, where you see young Israeli and young Emirati faces on the screen, just eager for the opportunity to get to know each other. The UAE is going out of its way to show openness to cultural exchange, religious exchange, to learn about Judaism, to make that part of this discussion. It's quite different. And every Israeli institution I could name, every venture capital fund, every startup, every hospital, every bank, every university is reaching out to their UAE counterparts to develop partnerships in those fields, even before the official agreements to implement the exchange of embassies and ambassadors and visas and so forth have been signed and implemented. So it's very, very exciting. From a U.S. perspective, it is absolutely the fulfillment, or at least a very, very major step forward on what has been a long-term strategic objective shared by administrations of both parties for many years. Full credit, obviously, to those in the current administration who helped see it through. But it is something that many previous administrations, including the Obama-Biden administration, worked on. In fact, Israel has already operated a diplomatic mission in Abu Dhabi since 2015 in an open fashion, not to the UAE government, but to an international organization called the International Renewable Energy Agency that the UAE competed to host. And the condition of the United States to support the UAE's hosting that agency was that they permit Israel to openly send a delegation to that agency. They've probably also engaged in some bilateral work too, but that is something that happened in 2015 very much during the time I was in government. And so this represents really a long-term trajectory, very significant progress on a long-term U.S. goal. It was welcomed warmly by Vice President Biden, despite it being obviously a contribution, an accomplishment of the Trump administration. And he not only said he welcomed this agreement, but that he would seek as president, if he's elected, to advance normalization with other countries, not to hold it back in any way. Also to use it as a basis for additional progress between Israelis and Palestinians. I'll mention that a little more about that in just a moment. But he really, as I think almost across the board in the Democratic Party, saw this as a win for the United States as well. Now there's the question of which other countries will join. Of course, Bahrain did just in time. I think, as Professor Rabi indicated, the Saudis are going to take a little longer, but none of this would have likely happened if the Saudis hadn't given it some indication of support, as they also did by permitting Israel to fly its plane over, as they now permit overflights between Israel and the UAE. And we'll see which other countries come along. Now, there was another very positive aspect of this normalization agreement. And that is that it led to the sidelining, and I think really quite in a very decisive and long-term way, the initiative that was on the table until then, which was that Israel was considering to unilaterally annex large portions of the West Bank. In the announcement and the agreement, that decision is described as to suspend annexation, and there's been some suggestions by Prime Minister Netanyahu that he plans to try to resume that effort. He said explicitly he could only do it with the support of the United States. But I think the reality is this is really off the table, at least any time in the foreseeable future. And this was a condition of the UAE when what really launched this effort was actually something very recent. Throughout the spring, or winter and spring, as you know, annexation was being discussed. And it was in June, middle of June, that the UAE ambassador to Washington, a man named Yusuf El-Otaiba, and a good friend, he's been there for many years, decided to publish an op-ed in an Israeli newspaper, in Yediot Achronot, on a Friday morning, the day of the main newspapers, in Hebrew, in which he said, in a very forthright, very respectful way to the Israelis who read it, you know, the UAE really feels like we are at a new phase in our relationship with Israel. We are ready to consider even full-scale normalization. We see Israel as an opportunity, not as an enemy. And so we are excited about those possibilities. But the one thing our Israeli friends need to understand is that annexation and normalization are not compatible with one another. It's going to have to be one or the other. And Israelis should know that, and they should make the decision that they will make. Now, that article had a very profound impact on the Israeli discussion over the next couple of weeks in the later part of June. And it was an important window because July 1st was the date that Prime Minister Netanyahu could have, under the coalition agreement, for the first time brought annexation formally to the government. And the fact that this opportunity was really presented to the Israeli public to say, wait, what would we be losing by going forward with annexation? There were other forces arrayed against annexation. Some members of the coalition, the Blue and White Party, certainly had raised their doubts about it. Jordan and other Arab states had expressed opposition. Democrats in the United States, from Vice President Biden to members of Congress, had expressed real concern that annexation could be the final blow to the very beleaguered prospects for a two-state solution. So there were other forces, but to have a leading Arab state lean forward in a very friendly and positive way and say, we actually see opportunities in our relationship with Israel, but we cannot pursue them if annexation goes forward, I think had a nearly decisive impact on shifting the Israeli to treat that essentially as an off-ramp and to help the Trump administration treat it as an off-ramp to this very unwise initiative to talk about annexation. And because it was laid out so clearly as an either or, and it was really a condition for doing annexation, for doing normalization, I really can't see Israel anytime in the foreseeable future causing a rupture or the harm it would cause to its relationship with the UAE leadership to try to sneak it in back under the table. And there's some history to this that we dealt with when I was in government. In 2010, as you may recall, there was already, as I said, a quiet but very productive set of relations between Israel and the UAE on security matters. But in 2010, a Hamas operative named Mahmoud al-Mabhouh, a very bad person who facilitated the smuggling of weapons to Gaza and other terrorist activities of Hamas, was assassinated in a hotel room in Dubai. Now, it was never formally declared who was responsible for that assassination, but the UAE government believed and said openly that they felt that Mossad had conducted the assassination. I think it's pretty likely that's what happened. And it caused about a year and a half of absolute freeze on the UAE-Israel dialogues, which often took place in Washington. And as I said, were something that we were all considered to be very positive. It was not just that the UAE took offense that this operation had been carried out on their soil in what they considered to be a violation of the spirit of the relationship they were trying to build, but it was really a sense of personal betrayal on the part of the leader of the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed. Well, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed is still the leader of the UAE. He, as I said, authorized his ambassador in Washington to lean forward and say, we see Israel as an opportunity, not as an enemy. We want to normalize. We just have to make clear that we can't do it if an annexation also goes forward. Having now consolidated the normalization, I find it inconceivable that Israel would risk yet again a rupture in that relationship with a person who really sees it as kind of a sense of personal loyalty, a personal integrity that was violated once and would not want to see it violated again. So again, I see this as some good news also for having taken annexation very much off the table. Now, of course, there were two negative reactions, or I'd say one negative reaction and one reaction which I think is unrealistic, and I think should be corrected to this very positive event. One is the Palestinian reaction, which of course was negative, not surprisingly. Palestinians had felt that the UAE and now Bahrain have gone back on the consensus of the Arab League, which was articulated in the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, which did offer normalization with Israel, but only sequenced first with the appreciation of the achievement of a two-state solution between Israel and Palestinians, and only then normalization. So to reverse that sequence was received very negatively by Palestinians. There's kind of an emotional reaction as they go through that, and a worry they have that other Arab states will follow the UAE and Bahrain. And some of them are going so far as to say, well, we're now abandoned and any prospect of two states is sort of buried, and we have to turn toward other means, God forbid, to armed struggle, which would be a terrible disaster for everybody. Others say, no, we'll turn toward trying to seek our rights in one state rather than in a two-state solution. But there's also a reaction among some Israelis, a bit of a triumphalist reaction, you might say, that, look, here we have proven that, in fact, much of the Arab world, these leading countries in the Arab world, don't care so much about the Palestinians, are prepared to normalize with us without having to, without any progress towards two states. All they asked was that annexation be taken off the table, and maybe we can get back to that. And so now we don't have to worry about it anymore. The Palestinian issue is resolved, or essentially it's off the table. We don't need to make any decisions, or certainly no compromise on it. I think both of those reactions are incorrect. The Palestinians will have to absorb this emotional reaction, but that doesn't change the fact that the only way they can ever actually achieve their legitimate goals of an independent state and self-determination is through negotiations with Israel, and is through a decision to live side by side in peace and security with an Israel whose legitimacy and borders they represent. And from the Israeli side, even if Israel were to normalize with all Arab states, it wouldn't change the fact that Israel's own identity as a Jewish and democratic state is going to be challenged unless it finds a way to separate from the Palestinians whose lives, for better or worse, it controls in the West Bank with some degree of autonomy today, but probably in a way that will be very hard to sustain over time. So I wrote a piece in the Washington Post with a colleague, David Makovsky of the Washington Institute of Near East Policy, in which we argued that, in fact, Palestinians shouldn't be so down in the mouth about this, and Israelis should be careful not to be too triumphalist about it, because the truth is, this normalization agreement, if it's used correctly, can be a basis for renewed efforts at trying to build momentum for a two-state solution. It's necessary for all the reasons I stated, and I think it will be seen, at least in a Biden administration, as a U.S. interest to try to do that, to keep Israel Jewish and democratic, to help Palestinians achieve their goals. But I also think there's some reasons to think this is the correct analysis. First of all, we know from history that Arab states that normalize their relations with Israel, like Egypt and Jordan first, have actually become much more involved in Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy. Egypt has hosted many negotiations. Egypt helps sponsor and deal with the ceasefires between Israel and Hamas. Jordan has been an important supporter and backer, and at times point of pressure on Palestinians to be in peace talks with Israel. So the fact that these are countries that have the ability to sustain a dialogue with the Israeli leadership, and now even more with the Israeli people, the way the UAE envisions this relationship, I believe means that they may have an opportunity to be influential far beyond their ability to be so as states that boycotted Israel. In fact, already in their speeches to the United Nations General Assembly just this past week, the foreign minister of the UAE, Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed, and the king of Bahrain, King Hamad, both stated that they are very excited and feel very positive, not the least bit sheepish about normalizing with Israel, and with no hesitation, they still hold to the traditional position that there should be a Palestinian state, they say, on the 1967 lines with East Jerusalem as its capital. Obviously, all those details could only be resolved through negotiations, but they intend to continue to advocate for that outcome, but now as partners with Israel who have embassies, who do normalize, who speak directly to the Israeli people and government. The UAE in particular would also be in a position, because of the resources it has, to provide assistance to the Palestinian Authority, which it has largely not over recent years because of the political disputes with the current Palestinian leadership. But there will be a transition. The current Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, is 85 years old. And with a different Palestinian leadership, it's certainly possible to imagine the UAE investing significant resources in helping build up the institutions of Palestinian, future Palestinian state, including supporting security cooperation between Israel and Palestinians. It's certainly possible to imagine that leadership building the kind of relationship with a new Palestinian leadership, in which they are able to put some positive pressure on them to come to negotiations, not to stay away from the table, to be realistic in the positions they adopt at those negotiations on things like Israel's status as a Jewish state or the right of return of Palestinian refugees, which no Israeli government can ever accept, not to Israel proper, and to truly renounce violence. It is also possible, as I said, that the dialogue with Israel will take a different character. And if this is paired with a U.S. administration that is ready to reprioritize a two-state solution as a central goal of U.S. policy, I don't think that's how I would describe the Trump administration's policy, that is prepared to sponsor negotiations when the parties are weathered, that is prepared to dissuade Israelis and Palestinians from taking the steps that are obviously harmful to prospects of two states, and to reinforce security cooperation and institution building, again, likely with a new Palestinian leadership. I actually believe that it is possible that this breakthrough of Israel's relationship with the Arab world can become a source and a platform for new momentum in the U.S., in Israeli-Palestinian efforts to achieve a two-state solution. Now, I'll mention one last piece of this big, important breakthrough, which is a little bit more complicated. And it's the one sort of fly in the ointment, if you will, from the U.S. perspective, or at least a certain U.S. perspective, and perhaps to some degree from the Israeli perspective about the normalization with the UAE. One thing that clearly was part of this package, and one has to acknowledge was part of the UAE's motivation for doing this agreement, was the clear commitment the Trump administration has made to sell the UAE the F-35 strike fighter, joint strike fighter. This is the United States' most sophisticated military aircraft that's ever been built, fighter aircraft. It's a fifth generation aircraft. It is considered to be a revolution in air power. And until now, Israel is only provided, of course, to the United States' closest security partners. And until now, Israel is the only air force in the Middle East that flies that aircraft. And that's a decision that was made by the Obama administration to ensure that Israel would be able to sustain its qualitative military edge in the region and be the only one to do so. Israel has bought 50 of those aircraft with U.S. assistance. About half of them have been delivered. The other half will be arriving in the next 5 years. And they have an option, obviously, to buy even more of that. Now, the Trump administration doesn't openly say or confirm that they have promised this deal to the UAE, but it's very clear from what the UAE has said, and pretty clear from what President Trump and Jared Kushner have said, that they do very much intend to sell this aircraft to the UAE. They see this as they see the UAE as a good partner. They see it as a benefit for U.S. jobs because of where the money will be spent to build the aircraft. And I believe it's impossible, really inconceivable, to believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu was unaware that this was part of the package. When it first emerged in the days after the announcement of the normalization, he said, well, I never approved it, and well, I don't even know about it, and well, I'll even oppose it. I'll even go to the U.S. Congress, which has to review and approve arms sales, and I'll even oppose it. It was very clear that he got a very strong pushback, first from the UAE, which initially canceled a planned meeting between the two countries' ambassadors at the United Nations as a bit of a shot across the bow, and then from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo when he came to Israel the following week. He got a very strong brushback, and after that he lowered the tone of his statements. He said, well, I didn't formally approve anything, which is probably true, but he stopped saying he had been surprised by it. He stopped saying he had been, that he would oppose it. And he did say that he fully expects the Trump administration to fulfill the United States' commitment to Israel's qualitative military edge. That standard, qualitative military edge, is a standard in U.S. policy. It has a technical meaning. It's now a standard in U.S. law that any arms sales to the region, as well as the assistance we provide to Israel, must together ensure Israel maintains its qualitative military edge. Now, once the UAE possesses this aircraft, it obviously will match, at least in that basis, a certain Israeli capability. And so that has to be evaluated. What will be the impact on Israel's qualitative military edge? Now, one analysis would say, well, the UAE is a very friendly country. It has no history of war with Israel. It's far away. It's a small population. It's obviously focused on the threat of Iran. It doesn't have refueling capabilities to send those aircraft toward Israel. It's really nothing to be very worried about. But there are other ways of analyzing what would be the impact of the F-35 being on the ground in the UAE or being in the air over the Persian Gulf, where others, Iran, maybe Chinese and Russian, who have Chinese and Russian elements who have presence in the UAE, would have an access to at least gain a better view of that aircraft. What might that impact be on Israel's advantage that it has by having the F-35 in its Air Force? A second issue is, what precedent does it set? If the UAE buys the F-35, are there other Arab states that may be not as stable or maybe closer geographically, like Egypt, like Saudi Arabia, to Israel, that might also feel that they will be in line to buy that aircraft? Traditionally, anything the UAE gets, Saudi Arabia gets. That's been the pattern over the past. And again, these are friendly countries for now, and Saudi Arabia seems to be moving in the same direction, but Israel has a long memory, and countries that used to be very friendly to Israel were Iran and Turkey. Well, Iran suddenly in 1979, and Turkey gradually over the last 20 years of Erdogan's rule have turned to enemies, or at least very unfriendly countries. And so there are various ways to think about how the F-35 in the UAE's hands and what might follow that could degrade Israel's qualitative military edge. Now, we've always been able to resolve these issues in the past. The way we have resolved these issues in the past is to have a very deep, very intensive consultation between Israeli and American military strategists and technical experts who sit together and they think about what is the impact of a certain capability in the hands of an Arab country, and how does it affect Israel's advantage, and what are the range of mitigations one could apply to deal with however it affects Israel's military capability. What's the quantity of the capability the Arab country will get? How does it measure against what Israel has? What specific capabilities? Obviously, a plane is just a platform. What weapons and other systems does it carry with it? What kind of end-use restrictions could the United States as the supplier impose on that country's use or basing of that particular system? Again, measuring it against what Israel has, thinking about those questions of precedent for other countries, thinking about the value of time. Even if this deal goes through, the UAE won't get its first F-35 until Israel has had its 50 F-35s in its Air Force for close to a decade. So there is some value of time and experience that Israel will still have. That normally what we have done in the past is we've had those consultations, those very deep, the U.S.-Israel QME, as we call them, consultations, before a decision is made to sell the weapon system to the Arab state, and only then it is notified to Congress, and then Congress, when it's reviewing it, often will turn to Israel and ask for Israel's opinion, and Israel will generally say in those situations, we feel that our needs have been protected in this deal. Now that all has to be reverse engineered. So instead of having the agreement between the U.S. and Israel in place first, and only then move forward with the decision to sell the F-35, the decision has been made, and now we have to reverse engineer those agreements. Last week, Benny Gantz, the defense minister, flew to Washington to basically open that discussion. It's not something you do in one meeting. It's not something that the Minister of Defense and the Secretary of Defense do. It gets down to the very, very nitty-gritty of the technology, and it will have to take place over many months. I'm sure it won't be able to be finished this year, and so it will spill over into next year. If there's a change of administration, obviously a Biden administration will have to make its own decisions about whether to move forward with the sale, and if so, how to ensure that Israel's qualitative military edge is protected. So I'll close there and leave some time for questions, but in summary, obviously I want to endorse what Professor Rabi said at the end of his remarks. This is undeniably a historic and very positive development in the Middle East, something we don't see too often. It is the continuation of a long-term trajectory from the point of view of quiet Israeli-Arab warming that is now coming out into the open. It strengthens the pro-American camp of moderate nations in the region, combining their efforts against common enemies. It opens up many, many opportunities that we haven't even seen in Israel's previous peace agreements because of the UAE's advanced economy and because of the attitude it is bringing about openness and cultural exchange and technology. And there's this very significant challenge of how the F-35 element of this agreement can be sorted out in a way that doesn't compromise Israel's security. But it's also a good thing that annexation has been taken off the table, which doesn't make the Palestinian issue go away. In fact, it may open some new opportunities to create some progress and some momentum on Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking as well. So I'll be very happy to stop there and answer any questions.
Okay, thanks, Dan. There's lots of questions coming in. So, so we'll get right to it. First question is on speculation about which other Arab nations are going to be next to normalize relations with Israel. And in particular, there's speculation around Syria. Any thoughts on the rumors around Syria potentially normalizing relations with Israel?
Well, the ones that have mostly been mentioned are either other Gulf states like Oman, and Oman has already had a long-standing, fairly open, unofficial relationship with Israel. They hosted Prime Minister Netanyahu a couple of years ago. Sudan, which has had a change of leadership and is thinking about how it can get off the U.S. List of state sponsors of terrorism, and if it can leverage a decision to normalize with Israel to do that. Kuwait, the Emir of Kuwait just passed away, and maybe that he'll be succeeded by a younger, less traditional, more forward-looking leader like some other Gulf states have happened, and Saudi Arabia, which everyone assumes will eventually do this, but it also is a sort of a negotiation between the young crown prince and his much older father, who takes a more traditional view. Those are the ones we have heard about. Now, just this week, for the first time, I think we're hearing these questions about whether or not Syria would be open to that. And I think one question is, would Israel be open to that, at least while the Assad regime is in Syria? The Assad regime obviously has been sustained because of Russian support. It's been sustained because of Iran's support. Because of that Iranian support, he has permitted Iran to use Syrian territory to introduce a significant amount of weaponry, rockets, missiles, drones, personnel, Shia militia into Syrian territory, which Israel, quite correctly, and with U.S. support, has felt that it has needed to strike and has struck hundreds of times in Syria in order to prevent that from happening, or prevent that threat from really materializing. So if any serious conversation were to get underway about normalization between Israel and Syria, Israel would have a lot to put on the table, which is Syria going to continue to act as essentially an enemy state, or facilitating Israel's most deadly enemy, using its territory to arm Hezbollah in Lebanon and also to pose its own threat from Syria. And I don't think, and I know from my own experience dealing with Syria in the early years of the Obama administration, this is before the Civil War and the revolution, that Assad is prepared to make those kinds of compromises. He sees those as essential pillars of his own regime's survival. There's a second question of, does Israel want to be in that kind of relationship with the brutal dictator who has essentially committed genocide against his own people? The United States has essentially no normalized relations with Syria. We don't have an active embassy in Damascus, nor is there a Syrian representative in the United States. So it's a question mark whether Israel wants to be in the category of states that seems to provide any kind of legitimacy to the brutal dictator in Syria. And then lastly, of course, at least in the past, discussions about such agreements were based on the idea of a land for peace formula, of Israel returning the Golan Heights, or at least major portions of it, to Syria. Of course, that's highly unlikely. The Trump administration has recognized Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Every Israeli believes that the Golan Heights has been essential for Israel's security, especially seeing what's happened in Syria, and the idea of returning it seems very far-fetched. And we don't know yet, because it hasn't really been explored, that whether Assad could decide that he would be willing to normalize with Israel without making any claim to the Golan Heights. So I feel like it's a very, very long shot. I'm not sure it's wise to pursue it. And I think the more likely breakthroughs, if they come, are going to be from the Gulf or perhaps from North Africa.
Okay, thank you. The next question is very similar to a question that was asked of Professor Rabi. And I think you're in a unique position to address it, having worked for the Obama and Biden administration. And that is, should Joe Biden win the upcoming presidential election, to what extent will we see changes in America's policy towards Israel specifically and the Middle East generally? And in particular, this questioner is asking to what extent Biden will be influenced by the left wing of his party that might have a very different agenda to President Trump's base.
Sure. Very happy to answer that. And I'll say as a caveat up front that I am a open and vocal supporter of Vice President Biden and his campaign. I am not officially connected to the campaign, and so nothing I say should be taken as the campaign speaking. But I'm pretty familiar with his views on these and other matters. So I'll say one thing much more generally about changes in the Biden administration foreign policy, which I think is important context before we talk specifically about Israel and the Middle East. And that is that he really would intend, I think, to bring a change in what President Trump has described as his America First foreign policy, but which often translates in reality into America alone. When we face so many of the international challenges these days are transnational. They cross borders or they don't know any borders. COVID obviously is the biggest one we're all facing at the moment. There's a years-long refugee crisis of millions, tens of millions of people in Asia and Africa and the Middle East on the move, trying to find a refuge from various conflicts. There is a climate crisis, which of course shapes all of our futures and requires international coordination to deal with. There's the rise of a newly aggressive or resumed aggressive Russia, and of course the rise of China. All of these types of challenges can only be dealt with in coordination with other nations, in coordination with allies, often through the venues of international partnerships. And so I believe a Biden administration would start from the proposition that it needs to re-engage with allies that President Trump has frequently disparaged, such as our NATO allies, sorry to say also at times our Canadian allies, with our Asian allies as well. The United States needs to resume its coordination or strengthen its coordination with international bodies and organizations and agreements like the United Nations, like the World Health Organization, like the Paris Climate Accords, agreements and organizations that Trump has either weakened U.S. connection to or withdrawn from fully. And in so doing, to restore the credibility of U.S. diplomacy that would enable us to be more effective, not just on dealing with those challenges, but across the board, because you need partners really on everything. Now, obviously, some things will not change, and to the good, they will not change in the U.S.-Israel partnership. The absolute commitment to Israel's security, to ensuring that Israel always has the means to defend itself by itself, to carrying out the $38 billion memorandum of understanding that was signed in 2016 in the last year of the Obama administration, which the Trump administration is now in the process of implementing, to ensure that Israel has that best in the world American military capability, that it has the missile defense programs it needs, that it can deal with the new threats of drones and cyber weapons and the like, that the United States layers within that assistance. It's not just assistance, intelligence sharing and cooperation, joint training between our militaries. None of that is going to change. That has been on a steadily upward trajectory for really decades, from one administration to the next. We in the Obama administration carried forward significant advances from the Bush administration. We advanced it. The Trump administration is building on our successes, and I believe a Biden administration would just continue on that same trajectory. And the push for normalization between Israel and Arab states would also continue. You know, some people ask the question, well, did the United States also subscribe to the Arab Peace Initiative, which set the sequence first of two-state solution and only then of normalization? The answer is no. We had to work within that context because the Arab states told us that was their position. But it's always been a U.S. position, and certainly would be of a Biden administration, to try to build on these normalization agreements and get more Arab states to do it without regard to where the Israeli-Palestinian peace efforts are at any given time. Now, what would change? There's no question that I think that a Biden administration would restore trying to help Israelis and Palestinians achieve a negotiated two-state solution and their conflict, or at least keep that very elusive goal alive. It may not be something that's possible to pursue immediately. The current leaderships totally distrust each other and have a history of failed negotiation. But to keep it alive and viable for the future, and to make that a central pillar of U.S. policy. That would mean, if they pursue that, shelving aspects of the Trump plan that are not consistent with a two-state solution, that don't describe anything that can be considered a viable Palestinian state. It would certainly include putting all actors' actions to that test. Does it help sustain the viability of two states or not? U.S. actions, of course, and what can be done by restoring various streams of assistance to Palestinians that the Trump administration has eliminated. Some assistance is withheld, and correctly so, because of a law called the Taylor-Force Act, which withholds funding to the Palestinian Authority in commensurate amounts to what they pay to terrorists who have committed acts of terrorism and are in Israeli prisons. But there are many other streams of assistance to Palestinian humanitarian needs, to hospitals, to water and education projects that don't go through the Palestinian Authority. And the Trump administration has eliminated all of those, helping to create a Palestinian economic crisis, which is not in Israel's interest, and helping to weaken security cooperation between Israel and Palestinians, which is not in Israel's interest. A Biden administration, I think, would also reverse the essential cutoff of diplomatic contacts between the United States and the Palestinian Authority that currently is the case, by establishing a consulate in Jerusalem, not by moving the U.S. Embassy to Israel back to Tel Aviv, that would stay in Jerusalem, but reestablishing an independent consulate to talk to the Palestinian Authority and helping the Palestinians have representation in Washington as well. It would certainly include holding both Israelis and Palestinians to their responsibilities for Israel not to expand settlements or pursue annexation in ways that make two states impossible, to Palestinians to end incitement and delegitimization and payments to terrorists and all of the delegitimization education it does to its own people. And it would urge Arab states to use this process of normalization to advance the prospects of two states. Now, some of this might take place in the context of a Palestinian leadership transition. I think that's very likely to occur in the next 4 years, and that's going to create some interesting choices and opportunities, maybe some risks as well that it would have to be layered onto. And then lastly, obviously, there would be a change of policy on Iran, not a change in any way of the commitment to ensure Iran never acquires a nuclear weapon, but some effort to restore some credibility to the U.S. diplomatic effort. The Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and reimposed unilateral sanctions against Iran, which have had a significant effect on the Iranian economy. But at the same time, Iran has reduced the time that it needs to break out to a nuclear weapon from over a year to less than 6 months. So it's closer to a nuclear weapon today than it was when Trump took office. Iran has been more aggressive in Syria, in the Gulf, in Iraq, and against various targets in the region during the Trump administration than it was under the Iran nuclear deal. And U.S. diplomacy, U.S. credibility, the ability to sustain a coalition to deal with Iran has been harmed, as we saw when the United States tried to get other countries at the United Nations Security Council to extend an arms embargo against Iran or to support the snapback of sanctions against Iran, and was totally rejected by nearly every member of the Security Council. So a Biden administration, I believe, would try to use a return to mutual compliance in the Iran nuclear deal as a pathway back to a more credible U.S. Diplomatic effort. It may not be possible. Iran may not be able to come back into compliance. But even whether it does or not, that's actually less critical. The more critical effort would be to use that renewed U.S. diplomacy, credibility, coalition, to seek a much longer, much stronger, much broader deal that would keep Iran from a nuclear weapon for a very, very long period of time and address its regional aggressive actions as well. Now, everything I just described, this is the last part of the question, really, I think, falls very much within the mainstream of U.S. foreign policy. And there are some new voices in the Democratic Party. I don't think we should overstate their numbers or their influence, but that take a somewhat different view on some of these questions. But I served as a member of the Democratic Party's platform committee, which we published the platform in August, right before the Democratic convention. And obviously the Biden campaign had a significant amount of influence over what was in the platform. And there were voices in the party that sought a certain change in the approach. And essentially the Biden campaign, speaking on behalf of the vice president, said, you know what, this is an issue that the man has worked on for 40 years. He knows his views. Nothing is going to change his views. As he said in the debate the other night, he is the Democratic Party today. He defines what the policy is. He does it in the best he can to be a big tent. But if you read that platform, it restates the fundamental commitment to Israel's security, including this $38 billion MOU, the fundamental commitment to fight any delegitimization of Israel, whether it's overseas at the UN or whether it's at home with the BDS movement, the absolute commitment to a two-state solution through negotiations in which both parties have to make the necessary steps and concessions in negotiations to do so. And all of that represents a kind of traditional approach to the U.S.-Israel relationship that I think is not anything like what some people describe a certain wing or certain members of the Democratic Party are trying to change. So I believe it's something that anybody who is concerned about the health of the U.S.-Israel relationship can feel very, very confident in.
Okay, thank you. We're just about out of time, but I'm going to try to squeeze in one last question. And I'm going to pick up on your theme around a two-state solution. And that is, to what extent would a resolution with the Palestinians need to include Hamas in order to create a meaningful and sustainable peace?
It's a terribly devilish problem, which obviously we've all been dealing with for about 15 years, since Hamas won an election, and then after the Israeli disengagement from Gaza, kicked Fatah out and took over Gaza. And we have all struggled. The Bush administration struggled, the Obama administration struggled, the Trump administration struggled, Israel has struggled with how to deal with that situation. And much of the Arab world has struggled with it as well. There is no way that Hamas, as it is currently constituted, and as faithful as it is to its own warped ideology, can be considered a partner for any kind of peacemaking. It is possible at times to do ceasefires. It is possible at times to work out the arrangements that allow the flow of goods and aid into Gaza. And that has been done by Israel. It is still done today by Israel, often facilitated by money that Israel allows to be transported in to Gaza from Qatar. It is something the Egyptians have played a role in. It is something that you can't turn away from the actual sort of day-to-day needs of dealing with that territory and that population, which suffers gravely under Hamas's rule. But it also means dealing with a terrorist organization openly committed to Israel's destruction that seeks to divert many of the resources, whatever resources it does get, to building rockets, to digging tunnels, to conducting attacks against Israeli civilians, which obviously have taken lives, threatened many more lives, and are completely unacceptable. And it has found itself in essentially permanent discord with the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank, the Fatah leadership of the Palestinian Authority, which, if anything, is more anti-Hamas than anybody on this call or anybody in Israel. So I don't see a prospect of reunification of Fatah and Hamas. They've talked about that ad nauseum for years and years. It never really amounts to anything because Hamas is essentially trying to overthrow Fatah in the West Bank. They are bitter ideological and political enemies. And the much more important effort will be to find a way to dislodge Hamas, to disarm and dislodge Hamas from control in Gaza, and to reintroduce a different Palestinian leadership into Gaza. After the 2014 conflict, of course, Hamas's aggression has produced 3 very significant conflicts in the last decade that Israel has had to fight. After the 2014 one, there did seem to be a moment when there was an effort to negotiate the beginnings of the reintroduction of Palestinian Authority officials into the border regions of Gaza, and then a gradual strengthening of PA capacity to assert its authority in Gaza, and it would have to eventually be paired with the disarmament of Hamas completely. It did not come to fruition. Hamas obviously eventually resisted it. The PA itself has not always shown the industriousness one might hope about taking on that project. It's not going to be easy. But in the end, I think that's the only way to reunify the Palestinian leadership, or reunify the Palestinian territorial entities, which is necessary to achieve a two-state solution under a leadership that has a prospect of negotiating a two-state solution with Israel. It may be possible to do those negotiations pending reintroduction of that leadership to Gaza, and it is essentially something that would have to be implemented in a second phase. But I don't see Hamas as any kind of possible partner. And what we have lacked, unfortunately, and not for lack of thinking about creative solutions, but obviously we haven't been successful, is a means of dislodging Hamas from control in Gaza. That remains a necessary element of achieving Israeli-Palestinian peace.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Dan. We're out of time, unfortunately, but I want to thank you for joining us today. I want to thank Professor Rabi for joining us as well. It's easy to see, Dan, why you've been such an effective diplomat, and at the same time leaving us with no uncertainty as to where you stand on these fascinating issues. So thanks very much for joining us. Shana Tova to you. Give my best to Julie and to your daughters. And I also want to thank everybody for joining us today at Canadian Friends of Tel Aviv University. Thanks very much for joining us, and Shana Tova.